for a fun day.
Thank you. Great. So we have Ed first, and then after Ed, we'll talk a little bit, quick Q&A for Ed, but then we can go around and everyone can say who they are, just so everyone knows everyone.
Fantastic. The mic is working for the. Okay, great. It's wonderful to be here. I want to make a starting observation, which is I think the IO plus urban is incredibly natural and incredibly important in a way that RCTs plus urban were not. Right? Because everything in cities tends to be a system, which doesn't mean you can't use RCTs to, say, evaluate the impact of place on a person. But any sort of large-scale intervention in cities involves moving too many things around. And it fundamentally makes it hard for, the inevitably small-scale nature of randomized controlled trials to actually evaluate the most important urban question. The opposite is true of the structural tools of IO, which are meant for making sense of systems at all points in time, and hence they are deeply emphatically connected to urban stuff. And that's why I think this is sort of such a natural thing. What Rebecca asked me to do is to sort of specifically say the 5 questions that I think are currently most important in the housing space, which is not I would have come up with a different 5 questions if it were the urban space more broadly. But my first one is my obsession with, what's gone wrong with America's housing supply. And, when I made my list of 5 things that I wanted to do with the rest of my life, when I stopped being department chair 18 months ago, it was certainly one of them, maybe the first of them. No, actually building our new building was actually first on it, but it was second. The second is a more IO version that is connected with it, which is why is the residential construction industry so fractured, so inefficient, so non-innovative, right? Especially for single family. And, this is tiny firms, entry cost, market power. 3, and this is there's a bunch of things in the papers today, and I've gotten 5 of you comments. I will get all 7 of you comments by the time I take off, because I'm leaving shortly. But the overall connection between interest rates and credit conditions on, housing market conditions more broadly. And so for the papers that related to mortgage-backed securities and foreclosures, it's good to think about those papers are terrific, but it's good to think about how those things fit more generally with the shaping of housing markets and the role of credit to that, in part because there's such a natural policy market for any information on that. And it's great that Paul Willen is here representing our Federal Reserve System, although, of course, he's not officially doing that. What is the impact of housing policies? So there are both demand-side interventions, as in vouchers, supply-side interventions, like the low-income housing tax credit, and regulations like rent control. 20 years ago, when I did a little bit of work on rent control, I tended to think that economists had spent too much time working on rent control relative to its policy importance in the U.S., given that 35 states had just ruled it out by fiat. Either fortunately or unfortunately, it feels like rent control research has now become quite important again, and it's great that that we have economists doing this. And then finally, what would an efficient level of housing production look like? Right? Why don't current land use regulations achieve that in efficiency if it doesn't? Right? And in some sense, this is sort of the larger question of the overall spillovers from building. And in some sense, it's the normative side of the first one. So why has housing supplies changed? These are just a couple of graphs to give you a sense of the enormity of the change, right? For those of you who are sort of under 40 today, America just used to look very different than it does now, right? Between 1950 and 1980, we added 50 million housing units to America, which was, more than doubling the housing supply. Just an extraordinary change to the U.S. Over the last 20 years, right, between 2000 and 2020, we added a grand total of 24 million. So just a much smaller percentage change, much smaller absolute change. If we had added housing at the same rate between 2000 and 2020 as we did between 1980 and 2000, America would have 15 million more housing units. This shows the rising prices that go along with this, right? And it's, we can debate why America's housing supply has crashed, right? But there's no debating that this is a change in supply conditions, right? It's Econ 101. Prices are way up. Quantities, at least as defined as the rate of new production, are way down, all right? And it's worthwhile differentiating. Supply can mean 2 things. Often when you're looking at sort of the local market conditions, supply is just the total number of units, and no, that has not gone down. The total number of housing units is up. But for things that are actually looking at the way the market is working, the way the construction industry is working, we use the flow rate, and the flow rate is massively down at the same time that prices are up. And of course, cross-sectionally, there appear to be a set of places where prices are very high and production is relatively low, and a set of places where production is very high and prices are much more reasonable. And that's sort of incompatible with a view that only demand conditions matter. Now, there also are places where demand conditions do matter, right? Toledo, Cleveland, Detroit, those places are not, like supply isn't relevant in those places. But, across these areas, there clearly is tremendous heterogeneity in terms of supply conditions. And of course, the point of my recent Brookings paper with Joe is that places like Atlanta, places like Phoenix, that were once sort of superstars of housing production, have now become increasingly, Californiaized. Okay. Last point I want to make. Actually, the piece of data that sort of convinced me above all that land use regulation was a dominant factor here was a fact that actually didn't use anything like exogeneity. It just used the difference between how much it costs to buy a house and how much it costs to build a house. And the only place in which that's sort of really clean, that you sort of know that this is sort of a violation of an open, unregulated sector, is in Manhattan, is where you build up. Because there you actually don't require added land to add space. And you just have to calculate the marginal cost of adding an n+1 floor, and that was half what it cost to sell that 25 years ago, and the gap has only widened. And so, again, it sort of makes a point for industrial organization plus urban that, in fact, it's the market logic that gives you power. It's the economics. It's not the sort of, we're just going to do causal inference till we're blue in the face. Okay, question number 2, why is the construction industry so fractured, inefficient, and uninnovative? So the last slide made the point that, we kind of know something regulations going on by the gap between building costs and the buying costs. But it also costs way too much to build. This is Turner & Townsend. They're a consulting agency. It's the difference across countries in how much it costs to build a 20-story office building. New York is a global leader in how expensive it is. But, San Francisco isn't that far behind. LA is still pretty pricey. Now, there are Houstons down here. Chicago's somewhere around here, too, not looking as terrible. So there clearly are places in America where so there's Chicago. It's bad, but it's not as terrible. America is clearly sort of a global outlier in this. And I think of this as not totally dissimilar to America's terrible public sector productivity, which was number 3 on the things I wanted to work on the rest of my life. The fact that it costs America 4 times more to build subway lines than it does the rich world average. The fact that, it costs $1.05 million for us to buy an electric bus in this country when you can buy a perfectly nice 36-foot electric bus from Kia for $350,000, right? It's sort of part of the general problem of productivity here. Together with Leo D'Amico, Joe, and Bill Kerr and Giacomo Ponsetto, we've tried to put together 130 years of data on productivity in construction. This is just homes per worker. And, what's interesting is you don't want to think that productivity always goes down in the sector. I mean, it was sort of flat 1900 to 1940. It rose enormously between 1940 to 1970 during the era of mass production with Bill Levitt building large suburban residential developments, and then it's declined since 1970. And so it's not as if the sort of Goolsby and Syverson view that, this is Balmo's cost disease, and of course it's going to get more expensive because it's a labor-intensive industry. That's right, but, all industries can suffer from that if you shut down technological change, right? The answer is there's no reason why there can't be technological change in housing, except for the fact that, we've regulated to a point to which every one of our new projects needs to be bespoke and go through its own idiosyncratic process, which rules out large scale, rules out sort of economies of scale, and rules out the ability to innovate. It's worthwhile just thinking about how different this industry looks in terms of its scale from any other industry. Right? None of the sort of large scale sectors in the US have the majority of workers in establishments with fewer than 10 employees. Right? Most of them have the majority of the employees in establishments with more than 500 employees. Right? And yet in single family construction, right, single family, you're looking at just these tiny, tiny firms. And you know what a firm with 7 people doesn't have? It doesn't have a research and development department. Okay? And that's related to this last fact, which is the increasing gap between patenting in construction and sort of everywhere else. So if you look up to, these things are normalized so they had the same number in 1930, but if you look at the 19th century, they're all kind of moving together. If you look up to 1960, they're kind of moving together. And then after 1970, they just totally diverge. And, this is a very industrial organization thing, but the fact that we sort of stopped innovating in this area is, a hugely problematic fact. Okay, fact number 3. What is the connection between interest rates and housing markets bubbles? This is this. I just took this one because I had it on my deck. This was in an old deck. This is Shiller real housing prices and the long-term interest rate from Shiller. The right housing data now to use is the Ronan Lyons, Allison Schertzer data, which is in the QJE for long-term stuff. Doesn't have to use the retrospective things that Shiller uses that are almost assuredly wrong. But during the height of the boom, it was sort of argued that the boom happened in 2007, 2008 because of easy credit. I took the con on that. Where I argued that, in fact, in a more sensible model, you wouldn't actually get the prediction of the Gordon growth formula that says that you're going to have a very tight link, especially between interest rates, especially when growth is relatively high. Paul and I Paul was on the same battleground as I was on the same side, but these issues have not gone away. And in fact, this is from a recent job market paper, Justin Katz's, right? The current obsession is rate lock. Is the fact that a lot of people have relatively low interest rates causing them not to sell their houses. All of this stuff requires fancy models to make any sense of, right? Everything to do with sort of interest rates and the flows and everything is an IO topic, and it's an important one. And the fact over there is just showing if you happen to have got a sort of mortgage at a higher rate, you're much more likely to sell. And of course, housing supply matters as well in terms of these bubbles. This is sort of Atlanta. During the boom, you had big changes in how much you have building. That's the green line. No changes in price. And this is San Francisco. Big changes in price. No changes in building. So it all sort of works out in the way that you expect to, again, using Econ 101 tools. Fact number 4, and Rebecca has really been amazing in terms of re-energizing this. Let me give you sort of 3 areas, one of which is housing vouchers. And there, I think the top of mind question there is incidence. Is how much do more generous housing vouchers, how much do they actually cause rents to go up? How much of it goes to the landlord versus the consumer versus the recipient? There, of course, there's a real question about whether or not we should have housing vouchers that are more spatially targeted, right? So we think that housing vouchers in a very inelastic market are much more likely to raise prices than in an elastic market. Obviously, the government is very bad at targeting things like that, but it's sort of an interesting question. It'd be nice to have more stuff on this. Secondly, the sort of supply side stuff. I'm highlighting 2 pieces of research on this, one of which is a 20-year-old paper by Sinai and Wolfogel, which asks, I think in some sense, what is the most important question on this, which is how much crowd out do you get from LIHTC? We're learning more about this from another recent job market paper, and it continues to be important. And of course, the stuff that I think Rebecca and Tim did on what are the local price effects, where I show the sort of the surface from their paper, are sort of totally amazing in terms of the ability to sort of look at the microgeography of this, and that was great. Then, of course, economists love rent control. Why? Because it sort of highlights the sort of fundamental question about what it is that the price mechanism does. Right? And it sort of shows that this is part of economics. And it's the one sort of Econ 101 way in which housing invariably shows up. Right? And so there are lots of great and fascinating things. Obviously, Diamond, McQuaid, and Chien is a great paper that looks at this. I also highlight the sort of quality stuff that we know from Otter, Palmer, and Patak. And then, of course, the work that I did 20 years ago that looked at the misallocation of housing when you turn off prices. This point of Nat Sherman, tobacconist to the world, residing on Central Park West, renting an apartment for $250, which he said was fair because he uses the apartment so rarely that he doesn't think it's an exorbitant thing, which of course just highlights the fact that he's not getting any surplus, which means it's wildly misallocated because in fact there are people who would get huge surplus from getting this apartment unit. Okay, 5th thing, what is the efficient amount of housing? So here's how I did it, again, 20 years ago. So there's a simple thing in the sort of urban space, which is the so-called Henry George theorem, which requires a bunch of assumptions, but it's proven by Arnott and Stiglitz in 1979. And the point is that with enough homogeneity of people, right, land value maximization is equivalent to sort of Pareto being on the Pareto frontier. So policies that maximize land value are Pareto dominant. This would not be true with a richer set of forms of sort of a bunch of people who are inframarginal in the place that doesn't necessarily follow. Then just think about the sort of amount of density you want to allow. Assume that D is the number of units, C is construction costs. Market demand delivers P of D. Price is a function of density. So then if you're going to maximize the total value of land, which is number of housing units times the price of housing unit minus the cost, you end up with a simple calculation, which is the gap between how much it costs to buy and how much it costs to build should be equal to the elasticity of housing prices with respect to density. So that's your simple optimality thing on a Henry George thing. My estimates from 20 years ago were that in much of Massachusetts, that gap between how much it costs to buy and how much it costs to build was as much as 50%. And that the elasticity of density with respect to elasticity of prices with respect to density was nowhere more than 10%. It was no more than minus 0.1. So you had a five-fold gap. I'm highlighting this not because, I think that I want you to believe that fact. I'm highlighting that fact because that is a very old school way of thinking about this. And in fact, we can use fancier and more persuasive models on this. I will make one last point, which is it is great, it is vital that we're embracing structural methods. Right? This is important. But it's also important that we actually do data work that can be convincing to policymakers, which also requires simple versions of this same thing. So there's a great piece of research that I think it's Jan is presenting it, right? Which looks at the impact of eliminating hidden fees for brokers for rental units, right? And it's great and it's entirely appropriate to have a structural model for looking at it, but the fact is so nice and simple that having a really simple version of it that you can actually take to members of parliament, to the Home Office, that's really sort of a vital thing in terms of making this case. And so I would ask you, while at the same time we do things that are sophisticated, structural, and so forth, you not to forget the fact that this is a live policy issue, right? All of these topics are ones that are floating around, and so having a version of what you do that is utterly persuasive, utterly clear, is incredibly powerful. And again, I'm just going to end with this and just thank Rebecca for putting me on the program and say, I am just so pleased to have so many incredibly creative, incredibly smart people here thinking about housing and thinking about urban issues. So thank you for having me, Rebecca.